To the September edition of the Collaborative Assessment Alliance webinar series. We're really happy you could join us this morning, or afternoon, or evening, or even middle of the night, depending on where you're joining from. But just a heads up that this webinar will be recorded, so we can share the recording with you, and you can then listen again and share with your friends and colleagues who were unable to attend. And we're very excited to welcome Jim Wynn, the CEO of Imagine Education, as our presenter today. And the way this will work is Jim will present for about 25 minutes, and then the remaining time will be open for Q&A. And we'll explain how that will be run when the time comes. But for now, I'll hand over to Greg Butler, who is founder and partner in Collaborative Impact, and he'll introduce Jim and talk a little more about the Collaborative Assessment Alliance. Greg?
Thanks, Matt, and welcome again to this Collaborative Assessment Alliance webinar. My name's Greg Butler, and I'm the Global Partnership Director for the Collaborative Assessment Alliance. I would like to start by thanking you for your interest in taking time to attend this webinar in the exciting area of collaborative assessment. This is our September webinar, and it's the latest in a series of webinars we launched this year. These webinars are aimed to promote thinking and dialogue in this area of this really interesting area of teaching and learning around collaborative assessment. Just let me people here who have come on. If you do come on and you come on muted, we'd like it if you would just stay on muted just so that we can maintain a fairly great. Okay, just starting up there. Thank you. So, the title of this webinar this month is Enabling Feedback and Assessment, and we'd like to thank Jim Wynn for coming and presenting that. Before we jump into that, I'd like to introduce you to the Collaborative Assessment Alliance. The Collaborative Assessment Alliance was formed a little bit over 12 months ago as a global membership alliance. It's really aiming at tackling the challenge of promoting advancement and innovation in digital formative assessment of collaborative skills. The purpose of that is to inform teaching and learning that enables all students to develop deep learning skills for success in their work and life. We started the Alliance with a number of partners, and I'd like to thank those partners today. They include Cambridge University Press, Collaborative Impact, ETS, Intel, Janison, Microsoft, and Promethean. To provide you with a little summary of what the Collaborative Assessment Alliance does and how it works, it's a global alliance formed of member alliances in local countries, each of them focusing on a unique aspect of collaborative assessment and the development of collaborative assessment tasks. Those tasks are co-created so that local alliances build tasks, they test those tasks, they try them out with students. In doing so, they build local capacity, and that capacity is around how they can build tasks and how they can use these tasks to transform teaching and learning. And it's really quite exciting seeing the tasks that are being developed now and the work that's going on. And we've leveraged existing research, things like the ATC 21S work, along with other research that's going on into 21st century skills and deep learning. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today. Jim Wynn is CEO of Imagine Education. Previously, he was Chief Education Officer at Promethean. He has an extensive career in education and technology, covering multiple sectors and many years. He's passionate about the role of feedback and assessment and how it can improve learning. And so I'd like to hand over to Jim and ask him to share with us some thinking around this area. Jim.
Thanks, Greg. And can I just start by probably making people jealous, but explain that this call, if I drop out every now and then, it's because I'm in Myanmar, or Burma as we used to call it. And I discovered when I got here that there's no roaming on cellular networks, so my mobile phone doesn't work even for texting. And the best bandwidth I can get is here at a downtown hotel, and it's awful. So I just really keep my fingers crossed that this works, and so if I keep dropping out, just please bear with me. And it's a bit of a reality check, because this is what it's like for a lot of people. And I'm here actually at a conference, the ASEAN Deep Learning Policy Series conference. It's the second of 8 conferences in this region. And the subtitle is Empowering Students with 21st Century Deep Learning Skills. And for 2 days now, we've been working together with around about 120 teachers, school leaders, and people from the government here in Myanmar, and also people from Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. And it's really interesting when you start talking about deep learning skills, how very quickly people start to talk about the assessment of deep learning skills. So if you could just move on, please, Greg. And by the way, normally I'd be controlling the slides myself, but we're so scared about bandwidth, I'm handing over control to Greg, so there's just a little bit less data flying from my end. So what I'm going to do is have a quick look at it from a high level, have a look at the scope of assessment, what's assessment all about, maybe have a look at why assessment is just hard to do day to day. Check out the growing reality of technology and its pervasiveness. Have a little look at how technology and assessment and feedback really can change what you think of assessment and feedback. And hopefully, if I can finish in around about 20-25 minutes, we hopefully can have a discussion. 2 ways to get feedback. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a chat box. So you can either send a bit of chat to an individual person, to Greg, or directly to myself, or to everybody, or you can use Twitter. I've actually got my mobile phone on the network here, so I can actually see tweets to @CAA webinar. So I'll pick that up. So let's see if we can get some feedback going as well. So if we can move on, Greg. On the next slide, Greg. Oh, is it just being slow? As the next slide comes in, what the next slide is an infographic about a project called New Pedagogies for Deep Learning. The conference I'm here working on is about deep learning, and deep learning looking at particular skills that everybody is agreeing that need to be developed: collaboration, you can see them at the top, problem solving, communication, creativity, character, education, and so on. I think we used to call those 21st century skills, but I think following Michael Fullen and Maria Langworthy's paper on New Pedagogies for Deep Learning, what we're really interested in is what the impact those skills have on life and on learning, and how we might actually build capacity by looking at how we deliver those skills through good quality leadership, how we measure the impact of the learning outcomes from those skills, and what professional learning we need to put in place. The next slide that you just saw a minute ago, which interestingly was shown by the Deputy Minister of Education here in Myanmar, not my slide, but he showed it. He showed a slide anyway. And I think, you know, we all know this Confucius quote: I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, I understand. But often in education systems, we're testing knowledge, the stuff we hear, and we tend to forget it unless we see it written down, and then we test it in exam rooms. But even Confucius 2,500 years ago was saying, look, if you really want to talk about true learning, we need to test the doing of skills, not just the recounting of skills. And Aristotle's quote, you know, that the proof that someone knows something is when they can teach it, starts to lean towards collaborative learning experiences. Now, you can't teach something to yourself. You have to teach something to a group. So the implication there from 322 BC and earlier is that if we want to test that somebody knows something, watch them using it in a collaborative situation. So, you know, for the last 2,500 years, we've been told that we need to develop assessment schemes that not only can see that you know a bit of fact, but you can apply it and you can use it in a collaborative learning scenario. Next slide, please, Greg. So what is the shift that's going on at the moment? So if we go forward 2 slides, I'll just keep talking whilst the slides are loading, but for a long time now, people have been talking about the shift in the shape of learning experiences. And there's a slide which is headed Change the Equation, which a good friend of ours, Professor now, Don Passy from Lancaster University, produced in 1998. And he said in learning situations, traditionally the teacher is responsible for all the input. The students might be allowed to think, and an awful lot of output from the students. And I wish I could show you this video from my machine in the bottom right-hand corner, but it's a video clip, again from the same sort of age, of two geography teachers who are using a piece of software to look at the distribution of shops in a particular town. And what the teachers are talking about is that the students are now able to focus on why the shops are in those certain locations and think about the geography and the theory of geography, rather than in the past when they've had to have allocated time in the lesson to draw the map in their exercise books and colour it in nicely and label everything up. And the teachers are saying, no, it's really changed not just how we teach this particular part of the course, but it's changed how we assess what's going on, because we no longer allocate marks to a student who can draw the map well or label it up well, and there would have been marks allocated to that in the past. We now allocate marks to the deeper learning, to the geography, to the analysis of the map. And some students that were getting high scores before because they were good at colouring in, were getting lower scores because they weren't good at the analysis part. So the learning objective has always been the same. Let's analyse why shops are in the positions they are. But the assessment scheme is completely skewed or changed or made better, if you like, because of technology introducing a collaborative experience where students can discuss where the shops are. Don says, and I'm pretty sure, didn't Einstein say something like, I never tell my students anything they can tell me themselves? And that's what Don is saying. You know, tomorrow's lessons or today's lessons in some enlightened teachers' rooms are where the teacher input is reduced. Students think a lot about what's going on. They think about it not just in their heads, but by talking to their peers, and they talk to their teachers. They receive a whole load of feedback, and as in the geography example, they do less, but they have a higher quality output. So this fat, thin, fat to thin, fat, thin change is actually, according to Don, and I think I like this, is the equation that's changing. But it isn't just the change in how the lessons run, it has an immediate impact on the learning objectives and the assessment of those learning objectives. If you can move on a bit, Greg, please. The corollary of that is, where are teachers? How are they teaching today? And some work that Don and myself did together, along with my team at Promethean, the Education Strategy Group, we surmised that a lot of teachers are actually in knowledge transfer mode in most of what they do. They're telling their students stuff, and some of them are better at that than others. So there is actually a learning curve where you can be better at a knowledge transfer teacher. But the assessment of what the students know in that one-to-many situation is obviously limited. So our conjecture was that student achievement must be limited. And if you want to move into other modalities, perhaps where you're sharing a learning experience with the student and you're moving into group work, if you like, or collaborative work, but still within a physical space, then student achievement can rise, but it requires a different type of skill, not just from, again, the learning objective, but how do you assess what's going on in that graphic there.
I think we've lost Jim for a second.
Hi, Greg.
Oh, you're back. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much you lost, but I'll just go on because I'm not sure when it dropped out. But I was just saying there that the implication of this diagram isn't that teaching in a knowledge transfer modality or knowledge sharing or knowledge community is better than the other. What we're saying is that if you have a well-formed learning program You'll mix and match different ways of teaching and learning, but you need to develop different types of assessments that work with each. Whatever you do and on the next slide, Greg, whatever you do, the job for all educators is to simply know what position their learners are in their learning journey, to know something about the potential of each learner, and the educator's job is to support the pathway between the position and the potential. Now, I put this up when I became head of John Cabot down in Bristol, and I ran my first staff meeting. This was the first slide, and I did it to deliberately provoke the staff, because I said to them, look, your job's easy. All you've got to know is the position of each child, know what their potential is, and plot the path. And you can imagine the reaction. We've got 30 kids in a class, how do we do that? In Myanmar today, 60 children in a class. I was in a class on the Kenyan-Ugandan border a couple of years ago, 93 children in a class. But this is the task of an educator, and you can't do any of this. You can't know the position of your charges and know their potential and plot their path unless you've got some pretty good assessment regimes in place. And if this really is going to be as personalized as this, and you are able to measure where the learners are in that process, I don't know how you do that without technology. Next slide, please, Greg. So if you look, and all of us on this call must have an interest in assessment, so you'll have your favorite bits of research and your favorite books that you can quote. But they all come down to, here's a piece of research from 1989, which says, look, there's three elements to assessment. The first is the object of the assessment. Are we looking at knowledge or skills or attitudes or behaviors? And of course, if according to the type of object of the assessment, it should change the type of assessment itself. On the next slide, Graham. The purpose of the assessment, and too often, especially in the West, the purpose of assessment is accountability. Have you got enough children passing at the right level? Rather than, as we can see on the left of this diagram, a formative assessment which informs not just the learning but the teaching process. And of course, the level of assessment, is it about individuals or groups? I think there's something missing from this diagram, from the what, the why, and the who. It's the how. We got Peter Jury on the call, actually. Peter is a master at adding dimensions to diagrams like this. And I think if Peter was doing this, he'd have a drawer come open on gatekeeping, and inside there, it would go backwards across all the different types of for the objects of assessment and so on. And inside there, you would find a whole toolkit about different types of assessment according to where you were on the diagram. And again, on the next slide, from the, just a very simple diagram from the year 2000, where people look at statements of learning, and then you have to think about, well, if I've got the statement of learning, what is it that I'm going to devise as the assessment measure? And you go around that loop until you agree what the assessment measure is. And then we create learning experiences which we use the assessment measures to see how we've got on towards that learning experience. Again, what's really missing from this shift, as the focus from teaching to learning, is how you do the assessment rather than what are you assessing. So 13-year-olds, maybe I used to be a math teacher, they can solve simultaneous equations when they're 13. But how do I assess that? Do I do it in group situations or whatever? And we have a drive towards rubrics, which will help us do that. This makes me think of different types of assessment that we accept all the time. On the next slide. Now, I didn't check where everybody was on the call. I know we have a worldwide call today. But even here in Myanmar, people have heard of the X Factor. And you can see from this picture on the left, there's an assessment going on of somebody singing. Just look at their faces. We can tell immediately what their assessment is. They don't think much of the person that's singing. What's interesting is there's no rubric. And we accept the professionality of the judges at choosing, or not choosing as the case may be, someone to be a superstar for the future. In fact, if you recognize that group above, which of course I do, it's One Direction. When One Direction came along as 5 individual singers, I think they were, but they certainly weren't the group. That group of panelists, without any rubric, brought them together, and now, whether you like One Direction or not, each of those boys is worth a fortune. They got it right without any rubric. Compare that to the apprentice master cobbler relationship, where over years working next to each other, there's assessment, formative assessment going on all the time by the guy on the left with the young lad on the right, until the point when the young lad on the right moves off to be his own cobbler. And again, nothing written down, all done by experience. And what's going through my mind here is, where have we lost it with teachers to be given that responsibility to assess the progress of their students without rubrics and everything else, and trust the teachers to do as the X Factor judges do, or the master cobbler does? But here's an interesting story on the right-hand side. I'm sure you all recognize Usain Bolt, who, do you know, the typical stature for a 100-meter runner before Usain Bolt was a fairly short, stocky powerhouse who could burst out of the blocks and get, you did not choose someone of Usain Bolt's stature. And his mentor, his coach, spotted something in Usain Bolt that actually did turn him into not just the world-class runner that he is, but actually somebody who killed the world record. And you can tell from the shape of the coach that he's never been a runner himself. He's never actually been like the master cobbler on the left. He's never run as fast as Usain Bolt, but he knows how to coach Usain Bolt to get there. Another part of that is, from the learner point of view, from the mentee, that for Usain Bolt to stay at the top, he doesn't keep with just one coach. He starts employing others to keep him there. Now, I think there's an interesting dilemma between what we're looking at here and what we're forcing into school situations, where people are looking at rubrics to measure things. And if we had rubrics for Usain Bolt, he would be something, what shape would that be? A rower? Maybe a long distance runner, but certainly not a sprinter. Next slide, please, Greg. When I taught at Cabot, we had an email system before email, and every single class had their own text-based dialogue. And at the end of one day, I used to teach A-level further maths, and I'd watch the dialogue going on between my class at night. And one night, I know I'm really sad, but this was going on at about 11 o'clock at night. John Williams, one of my students, sent an email out to all the rest of the class, as you can see, saying he finds it a bit hard. Obviously, my teaching wasn't as good as it should be. I've forgotten how to do the damn thing. So we just click through the slides, Greg, so we can see the dialogue coming up. Somebody comes back and says, well, I did it like this, actually. Samir comes back, I didn't find it so hard. And you can see they're pushing their way through text to be able to explain stuff. I can't do the funny thing called an integration sign. And then somebody comes back with another bit of text and another bit of text. Now, for me, this was absolutely gold dust, because I can see the dialogue going on between my students, and I can now assess something which I couldn't do before because I wasn't part of that conversation. I could assess before tomorrow's lesson that John didn't get it, because John never told me whether he got it or not in class. And so being able to listen in to that dialogue, being in the cloud, if you like, and look at the dialogue that's going on. They're pointing him at Matt's site, they're telling him to do his homework. I'm hardly taking part in this at all, but being an observer of that was crucial to me being able to formatively change my teaching style. However, at Promethean, we carried out some work in 31 schools in the north of England, where we helped teachers formatively assess their students each day. And they thought it was amazing. We've got videos of the teachers saying how amazing it was. But you know, most of the teachers just plowed on regardless with their teaching plans for the rest of the week. They didn't find it possible to actually alter how they taught the next day. That really worried me. And I think it worried me because we got the professional development bit wrong. We assumed that if the teachers knew more about their charges, they would change what they do. I think we've got to change the equation. So on the next slide, I think what we have to do is to actually stop putting the student first for teachers. We actually have to help teachers think about learning objectives. Now, the Promethean people on the call recognize this this diagram. It starts off by saying to teachers, what's your learning objective that you want to deliver? How can you make decisions about the ways to teach for that particular learning objective, the ways you want students, your learners to learn? And what are your feedback strategies for this particular learning objective? And that will change according to the nature of the learning objective. We saw it on that research from 1989, that if the learning objective's nature, whether it's a piece of knowledge, a skill, or understanding, should really drive the type of teaching modality, the type of learning experience, the type of feedback strategy. And then that should allow the teacher to choose the right content and the right technologies, so click, the right learning happens. And that's when the student comes in the equation, because you'll choose the right content and the right.
Just give Jim 1 second to see if he comes back. I think he will.
Did you lose it again there?
There you are. Yeah, just for a second.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. So going back to Don Passy, Greg, Don talks about pedagogical resonances with particular learning objectives. And I think if we can get teachers, and you can see what I've done here, I've just found 3 good headings to go underneath each of these different areas. There's more, clearly there's more. But what we find a lot of people talking about, and it happened today in Myanmar, people talk about content, only about learning content. They talk about learning experiences, always about personalization and authenticity, and they don't glue all the other bits of the equation together. So as a mathematician, what that would mean for me on the next slide is if I'm teaching grade 1 topics and I'm looking at arithmetic, I need to look at what the subject matter is underneath the arithmetic, and I pick out number bonds, which drives me down to a learning objective for number bond lessons. And I've got to think about national objectives, performance criteria, and assessment methodologies that will marry in with my teaching and learning strategies. Now, this is a meaty thing because there's lots of learning objectives, and I think teachers have to find a way to take learning objectives that they perhaps aren't happy with their success and analyze them in this way. So it isn't just one size fits all, but we need to get teachers thinking particularly about changing types of assessment, learning objective by learning objective. The next slide comes from Michael Fullen's book, The Meaning of Education Change, and some of you might even know the new meaning of education change. The book I'm referring to comes before that. And it's just a different way of saying what I've just said in the previous slide. Teachers select the knowledge. That's what teachers are paid to do, to take the knowledge from the national curriculum and select the task, make sure that the stimulus of the task marries in with the learner's learning characteristics, think about prior learning, build the content and structure, choose the learning and teaching accessories, carry out the activity, and then carry out the learning. The next click should change the learning and teaching accessories to add the word assessment in. We need to have teachers think about all 3, and that way we can enable feedback. A couple of clicks more on the next couple of slides, because it's interesting, and it's really a lovely position here in Myanmar with the connectivity not working, yet everybody's got a smartphone in their hand, everybody. And I've shown this slide a lot because I love it, about the change in what's happening. Pope Benedict in 2005 being unveiled, and you can see on the slide there a couple of smartphones, hopefully, but not many. And if we click through to just a few years later to Pope Francis in 2013, the difference in the number of smartphones in the audience is incredible. It's absolutely incredible, the difference. Everybody's doing it. And we all know what happened when Mandela died. On the next picture, even Obama and Cameron and the Prime Minister of Denmark were doing a selfie. And the next day there was a joke in the Times on the next click that even people like Gandhi and my brain's just gone dead because I'll say I'm tired. The selfless ones in in heaven are taking selfless leaves, as Adrian Blight called them earlier today. The point about the slide is that the technology is ubiquitous now, so we can start to think about what everybody's been talking about marrying in school and out of school activities. I hope the builds on the next slide work. But what I want to try to talk about on the next slide is the shift towards new curriculum architectures. In class, during the day, and I don't think classrooms are going to disappear in 10, 20, 50 or 200 years. I think we're still going to have physical classrooms. The difference is that, you just click a few times, Greg, as we go through, if you please. In between physical classes, students are already, and we know that students in well-connected places are already going off and looking at the Khan Academy, and they're doing their own work up in the cloud before they come back to the next class. The question is, of all the different types of teaching and learning that are going on, if we knew that stuff was going on in the cloud, in between our physical lessons, what would we put in the cloud? And what would we be assessing in the cloud so that we could, a bit like my text-based example from my maths class, I knew that there was discussion going on, synchronous discussion going on, so I looked up and I saw it, and it informed what happened in my class the next day. What else could we push up there? Now, in countries, in developing countries, where connectivity isn't very good, but also education budgets are tiny, so the amount of money spent in some countries in this region in the whole of a student's K-12 career is less than $2,000 in 10 years. The cost per year of some children in some schools is $45 a year. With such low resources, the physical classes become incredibly poor. If and when connectivity comes, we could push an awful lot of learning and an awful lot of collaborative work with your subject group, your project group, your tutor group. The tutors themselves, the assessors and mentors can be in this much cheaper place in the cloud, but still being synchronized by physical classes. I think there's a lot of work to be done of marrying in learning objectives with learning modalities, of which you can see the different ones here: reinforcement, investigations, practice, discussion, with physical classes, and with teachers able to orchestrate the movement between below the line physical and above the line virtual. Just a couple more clicks through to the good old PISA. Now, PISA comes under the Program for International Student Assessment from OECD. Comes under an awful lot of attack for forcing assessment for countries to put their assessment regimes into some sort of pecking order. What a lot of people don't understand is that the border between level 1 and level 2 is about employability. It doesn't really matter where you are on the league table. It matters about the proportion of students that are below that red line, level 1 or off the scale, or above the red line, level 2 and above. Level 1 questions are basically knowledge recall. Level 2 are simple applications of that knowledge recall. Level 3 are simple problem-solving tasks, and level 6 are creative problem-solving tasks. So Shanghai, for example, on the far left, has been under a lot of criticism for forcing their children to be spoon-fed to produce the results that you see there on the far left. You cannot force-feed children to be creative problem solvers. They're doing something much more than that. The question is, as economies develop, is the shape of the workforce that you're developing, of people being below that line or above that red line, marrying into the needs of your economy? If you have a lot of unskilled work, it probably doesn't matter if some students are falling below the line, because they'll find work. If, on the other hand, there's very little unskilled work, they're going to struggle to get jobs. One more click, Greg. One of the things that people are predicting, though, is that line is going to move. And as the economies develop, then the bar is going to move between employability and unemployability, where people will be expected to no longer just be knowledge recall people, to be people who can at least apply knowledge in a simple problem-solving capacity to do everyday jobs. Those of you who know Riel Miller, the futurologist at UNESCO, will know that he talks about the shift in knowledge recall driving assessment. So when in the last century people actually needed to know things to do their jobs, that's how we constructed schools and that's how we constructed assessment. And we still have a throwback to that. Now the slide that you can see now is about, do you trust your sat-nav? Now sat-nav is a bit like that diagram I showed earlier about position, path, potential. The position is where you are, the potential is where you want to go, and the path is the best route. Now you can see it just really didn't work for that lorry because the sat-nav had no idea about the size of the lorry. And there are signs appearing now, like on the right-hand side, that don't follow your sat-nav down the very narrow road. Sat-navs are like simple types of formative assessment, but they only tell you one route. They don't think about you as the individual being too fat to go down the road. They actually think that one route will suit all. And what worries me about some of the data systems that have been produced, which are trying to push people through curricula by assessing where they are and telling them where they're going, they're a bit like crude sat-navs. They're not able to do what teachers can do. So on the next slide, you can see that a concept map for chemistry might link different learning objectives together, but actually there's a myriad of ways you can link those learning objectives together. I don't know if you've got the next slide, but I haven't got it quite yet. But I love the sign on the left is ignore the sat-nav and engage your brain. And I think that's a metaphor for assessment, that somebody might say one particular route way between these learning objectives is right, but it won't work for everybody. And this is where this concept map might exist in a computer, but I really do think that formative assessment and the intelligent coach and mentoring schemes, as in the Usain Bolt example, will enable teachers to navigate their way through that. Now, we've heard a lot about big data, and the next slide shows what I think is a really good metaphor for big data, and it's flying an aircraft. An aircraft cockpit has got hundreds, if not thousands, of dials. But to fly an aircraft, you probably only look at a small amount of data, about a half a dozen dials. Am I going at the right speed, the right direction? Am I trim? And so on. And there's a really interesting story about the top right-hand dial, the altimeter. You can see there's two types of dial information there. One is digital, the other one is analog. The digital data is really good at telling you exactly how high you are, to the meter. The needle, right? The needle is not very good at telling you the exact number, but actually if you start to go into a dive, the digital meter just turns into a blur. But the needle tells you the rate of change. So they're both telling you the same data, but one tells you the exactness of the data and can't tell you anything about rate of change, but one's the other way around. So it isn't just about the data itself, it's how you represent it. And if something is going wrong, I think it's a really good metaphor for formative assessment. You can click through on that one dial and then look at a whole lot of other dials. So big data might be good, but unless you can represent it in a really good way as small data, then it's no good to you at all going forward. The next slide is just one. I hope you've heard of Hans Rosling. If you haven't, please Google him. And Hans Rosling has been finding ways of representing in 2 dimensions 5 different types of data. This has been around for quite some time, but I don't think it's really caught on in the education world. And Gapminder is now a free download. So just Google Gapminder and download the exe file. There's a Mac version and Android versions, but it can show you how to represent on this axis here, the 2 axes, that's 2 dimensions. You can also see the size of the data, that's a 3rd dimension. And the color tells you where the country is in the world, that's 4 dimensions. And when you press play, you can see those dots moving with time, 5 dimensions. Imagine if you could see the learning journey against different dimensions of students, and you could see the rate of change, the size of the change. I think we're in the infancy of representing big data in small ways like this, and we can learn from Hans Rosling. At that point, Greg, I'll stop and open it up for questions.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for that presentation. It's great to get your view on and your position on feedback and assessment, and I think there were lots of questions that came up in that presentation. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open up for a Q&A period. The way to do it is through the chat box. So if you don't see the chat box, you can go to the green bar at the top of the screen and select chat, and you can type your question in the chat box, and then we will share those questions with Jim. So please, if you have a question, put it in the chat box now, and we'd love to hear that from you. Jim, maybe while we're waiting, a quick question for you. So you mentioned there the use of handhelds, and obviously that's an area of growing interest. As far as feedback goes, have you seen really good examples where people are using feedback to drive that formative assessment in teaching and learning?
Oh, I have. All the way from
Jim, there?
I'll keep talking and tell me if...
Yep, you just came back then. There you go.
It's just the bandwidth again. It's the person in the room next door using the bandwidth, I think. I was just saying that there are issues around asking children for feedback, especially in group situations, where there's a Pavlov's dog type response where people will often agree with who's next to them. Whereas if you can respond privately, not only are you telling the truth, as it were, but the teacher can see the respondent, the recipient of that information can see how you're responding. I've even seen it with adults. We ran, when I was at Promethean, a training, a workshop for a government. I will not say which the government was. And we had the deputy minister and the head of schools, the head of assessment, the top team. And we started talking about formative assessment. And we asked a couple of questions. And we put a bar chart up of the responses, an instant bar chart. And some people were voting 1 out of 5, and other people 5 out of 5. And they looked at each other and they realized that as a Ministry of Education, they did not hold a common view about what formative assessment was. It was fantastic. I guarantee you, if we'd asked those questions out loud, we wouldn't have reached that position. I was in Delhi last week, week before last, in a school, and they were using formative assessment machines in mathematics, and the teacher had a constantly moving bar chart of responses. And she was able to go and see that Sanjay was struggling and getting everything wrong, and go and use her very valuable time to pick out children that were either doing well and needed more work, or not doing well and needed more support. She thought it was amazing from that point of view, but she said, you know what's really good? I don't do any marking anymore. Actually, I'm just doing analysis because I'm getting this feedback. So I think, Greg, there's huge use of individual devices to give feedback in that sort of teacher-learner relationship. But I could go on. There are wonderful examples of students, you know, from ACT 21S, how students working in groups can develop their collaborative skills by getting feedback within the group to each other about a problem they're solving. I actually think technology is critical in that process.
Jim, I have some questions here for you, and I'll share them with you and the group. So first question I have is from Scott Paris, and his question is, Myanmar and Asian countries are a long way from collaborative and technological pedagogies. How do you start to change practices in schools throughout Southeast Asia, so in that region?
Well, I hope I can answer that one, Scott, because that's what we've been doing for 2 days. And the first thing that we've been talking about is actually trying to make people understand that you can do a lot without technology. The diagram I put up earlier, the one with the learning objective at the top and the teaching and learning and the feedback modalities at the bottom, is a really critical place to start, because the first thing you have to start is to understand what the pedagogies that are in place at the moment and help teachers develop their skill set through to knowledge sharing and knowledge community type modalities. So the change in practice has to be frankly slow. I don't believe in leapfrogging. I believe in taking people on a journey because people won't believe the impact. But here in Myanmar today, we had 120 people in the room, and it was quite refreshing how many teachers are saying they're already using critical thinking skills in class on paper. And in fact, I quoted an assessment which I know other people on the call have heard me talk about before from India, where a maths question has got nothing to do with technology says Sanjay was given 150 rupees by his dad as a present, and Sanjay decided to spend 50% on a present for his grandma, 25% on a street child project, and he saved the rest. How much did he spend on his grandma? How much did he spend on the street child project? And how much did he save? And do you agree with what he did? Now that last little rider opens up a discussion in a group, which is the start of collaboration. Now, part of that, you actually have to sort out assessment, because you're now into group discussion situations, and also there ain't any right and wrong answers to that last bit. It's about how the students are collaborating with each other, which does challenge the maths teacher, who can mark the percentages correct or incorrect in the past. So I think there are some lovely examples like that which aren't dependent upon hardware, but will take you towards a route towards technologies.
Thanks, Jim. I have another question here from David King. And David has a question in relation to tech-enabled curriculum architectures coupled with teacher, mentor, tutor as the orchestrator. Is it an idealistic notion due to limitations of two-way connectivity in certain sections between teacher and students, e.g. in certain school districts in the US, teachers are forbidden from online contact with high school students? How can teachers orchestrate if they are not invited to the performance?
Yeah. Well, you can hear the disappointment in my voice about how worried people get about these online scenarios. Obviously, that as we settle into this new world of hyper connectivity, lots of things are going wrong. From bullying to everything else that I don't have to mention, that's challenging us to know how to live in this new society. I just reflect on the fact when was Facebook started? 2004, is it? I think that's right, isn't it? 2004 Facebook was launched?
Yep, I think you're right.
So we've had 10 years of social media. We've had 2,500 years of textbooks. We've had 2,500 years of people in rooms talking to each other. I would just throw it back and say we are in the infancy of knowing how to deal with this, and we will get reaction against things that can go wrong. You know that, well, I heard a quote the other day of someone saying, the policy for mobile phones in Moscow is going really, really well. I can't remember who was talking about it. And somebody said, what do you mean? What's going on? He said, we've confiscated 250 this week. We've managed to get rid of all the phones off the kids. And the story goes on because the person looks in he says, well, can you show me them? And the person looks in the box and there's all these old phones, these old Nokias and stuff. And the head teacher's really pleased he's got all these phones. You know what the kids were doing? They had an old phone that they didn't mind being captured, and they kept their smartphone in their pocket. Head teacher hadn't a clue what the kids were up to. There's a lot going on over this. It shouldn't stop us designing things for the future. The fact is, the point, if you go back to that curriculum architecture one, let's get rid of the communication bit. If you knew that the students were going online and you weren't watching, but you knew you were going to the Khan Academy and looking stuff up before they came back, isn't that something that would change things? So I think, again, the thing I was talking about today is diffusion. many teachers aren't changing their practice, but there's amazing practice out there that isn't being diffused through to the masses. We need, as a group, to tell people about what works and what doesn't work and break these barriers down a step at a time if we can.
Thanks, Jim. I think I've got time for maybe one or two more questions at the most. I do want to make sure that we wrap up on time today. But so I'm going to take a question here from Liam Neal. And the question is, would you consider, I like the idea of measuring assessment and relating these to many dimensions, such as time, age, skill, etc. Would you consider these rates of change, the dimensions being sufficient measure of emergent assessment to match emergent collaborative tasks?
I'd throw that back to the learning objective. I think I've sort of seen the light that if you look at a particular learning objective, let's take one, health education. I need to know that I need to wash my hands. What's the right way to create the right learning experience and the right formative, or the right assessment scenario to know whether or not the students they've got to wash their hands after they've been to the toilet? You know, I think it really comes down to building wisdom around these pedagogical resonances which marry together the content of the learning, the content of the teaching, and the content and modality of the feedback mechanism. Some of that will be summative, by the way, because we'll have to do that. But I think it really comes down to learning objective by learning objective and not one size fits all.
Thanks, Jim.
Did that answer that question, Greg? I'm not sure it did.
Well, I didn't ask the question, but I think post a note if you want. And there's a lot of chatter going on, which is really, really good. So people are obviously very interested in this area. I'll finish off with, actually I may just finish off there. There's some great questions there and people are welcome to chat and answer those questions. Thank everyone for participating in the webinar today. I would like to start by thanking Jim Wynn for presenting today. Jim, we appreciate it. Really stimulating talk, got people discussing the topic. And we appreciate you coming online, and particularly coming online from Myanmar, which is half a world away from many of us, I'm sure, at least. So I would also like to thank everyone else for coming on board. We will follow up this webinar by sending you an email with a link to the recording so that you can share it with colleagues and share it with others. And we also would like to send you some information about the Collaborative Assessment Alliance and the work that we're doing. And if you are interested in finding out more, please contact us either through the website or through Twitter or through email. Again, thank you very much for joining the webinar today. We appreciate you being part of it, and we hope you have a good day no matter where you are.